This is Picasso's Girl Before Her Mirror, an oil on canvas, 64 by 51 inches, a large cubist portrait in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Here we see Maria Teresa Walter, Picasso's 18-year-old mistress in a bathing suit, looking into a swivel mirror. Notice how Maria Teresa Walter's white haloed profile makes her appear serene, with its smoothly lavender pink profile on the image on the left-hand side. This merges with a more roughly painted frontal view of her face, which is bright yellow crescent, like the moon, and yet it reminds one of the sun and is made up of red lipstick, rouge, and green eyeshadow. We see a day image of Marie Theresa and another more personal, fleshy image of herself. There's a sense of tranquility here, and yet vitality. Picasso suggests vitality in the circles and curves and the bright colors that seem to keep the eye moving around the painting. And yet Marie Teresa Walter also seems to come to grips with her worldly and mortal older self in the mirror. This is a vanitas image, an image of mortality and death perhaps, where her eyes in the image on the right-hand side are hollow and maroon, and she's surrounded by darkness, and her body seems more twisted and sagging in the mirror, where she seems older and more anxious. The swivel mirror of the 19th century was known as the Psyche in France and Austria, where it was believed to reflect the viewer's inner being or her soul. This is Edvard Munch, M-U-N-C-H, his painting called Puberty from 1895, an oil on canvas. Relatively large painting at 60 inches by 43 inches in the National Gallery in Oslo, Norway. In this painting we see loneliness and isolation, which are emphasized by the deep resonant shadows, the shadow next to the girl and also underneath the bed seem very highly textured, seem to take a life of their own. At the same time we see isolation and loneliness also emphasized by the heavy and reinforced contours around the figure and also the figure's closed stance with arms crossed and legs close together. We see the brushstrokes seem to be muted and scratched as if to call attention to the surface of the painting, again to emphasize the emotion, the feeling that went into the painting of this work. This is Theodore Géricault, a 19th century painter of Romanticism. This is one of 6 portraits by Dr. Etienne Georget, Georgiet. Georget was a psychiatrist, a new field of study in France. The artist was commissioned by Georget to paint these bust-length portraits showing different states of mental illness that Dr. Georget would use in his lectures on psychiatry. These are life-size figures with an impressive physical presence. They're dignified by their bonnets and shawls and collars that they wear. There's an uneasiness in their expression, which with restrained inner agitation, the figures seem mentally isolated as they gaze off into the distance. They're individualized by the tilt of their head or the various traits of their eyebrows. They are no longer possessed persons, nor monsters, nor buffoons, but rather they seem to be sympathetic, sober individuals, close at hand. A new feeling about madness or insanity that is more scientifically based. And so we see these figures close up to the surface of the canvas as they peer out, seem to be fixed on something, fixated on something in the distance, and yet frozen in their expression at the same time. Chaim Chaim Soutine, The Madwoman, 1920. This particular painting shows an individual, a portrait of a woman from 1920 by this French expressionist painter living in the heart of Paris with 3 or 4 other expressionist artists like Modigliani and Utrillo. We see here, in fact, the accent of a predominant color. Some portraits are red, some are blue, or some are white, whereas the artist is calling his attention to the first impression, almost to an extreme. The work is frenzied in slashing strokes of color, strong, heavy pigments that move the figure to the forefront, heavy pigments in the background that push the figure forward as well. We see the figure almost seems to be weak, fragile, incapacitated, fearful. We can see, in fact, her hunched shoulders, head leaning forward, and her eyes looking on fearfully to the side, almost awkward and disjointed.